goodbye. And all the times I do this, there are still things I falter on. I'm a flawed human being. We're reading from Daniel, the book of Daniel, and we're reading all of chapter 8 as we continue through this discipline of hearing and engaging ourselves in God's word fully. So this is Daniel's headed in the ESV, English Standard Version, Daniel's vision of the ram and the goat, Daniel chapter 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which was in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there is no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host, and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over to the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful place." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end." And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for many days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it.
Thanks, Calvin. So we are in the second section of the book of Daniel, where we have prophecy after prophecy, and so hang in there. It's going to be a fun, interesting ride as we get through the last 4 chapters in the book of Daniel. A couple things just in terms of introduction. One, I noted this all the way back in Daniel chapter 2, but one of the things I noticed is that from chapter 2 to chapter 7, Daniel actually writes this entire section in Aramaic. And so, sometimes people say, oh, what languages are the Bible written in? It's written in Hebrew, it's written in Greek, and a little bit in Aramaic. Well, here's the biggest section of Aramaic that we have in the Bible is Daniel chapters 2 to chapter 7. So now that we're in chapter 8, in the original text, Daniel actually switches back to the Hebrew. And it's always been, actually, we're not really quite sure. So I've read a lot of reasons, and a lot of scholars are very confident. But I don't think we're really that sure as to why Daniel switches back and forth. Although some people said that perhaps the reason is because 2 through 7 is Daniel's interaction with the outside, with non-Jewish people, right? So he's dealing with the kings of Babylon, the kings of Persia, and then finally in 1 and then now 8 through 12, Daniel's now dealing with the matters of God and his covenant faithfulness with Israel, right? So now the attention kind of shifts towards Israel, no longer towards Daniel's interactions with the outside kings and rulers. So just wanted you to know that there is a little bit of switch here in the original text as Daniel switches back to the Hebrew. Now, the other thing to note here is that as Calvin was reading, when Daniel receives this vision, it's 200 to 350 years before these events actually take place, right? So Daniel is in Persia. He receives this vision. At this point, the Greek Empire is still small. They're still little city-states fighting among themselves. And so when Daniel receives this vision, right, it's 200 to 300 years before these events actually take place. And the thing is that Daniel describes these events, this vision describes these events so perfectly that scholars and academics are forced to say that Daniel could not possibly have written this chapter. And so in seminary they have us read all these Bible critics and all these scholars who don't actually believe the Bible is the Word of God. And basically all scholars have to agree that Daniel describes the events that are going to happen so perfectly that this can't possibly have written by Daniel, right? So everyone basically concludes that this must have been written later on and then added back into the book of Daniel. And the reason is because, he just describes these events so perfectly, right? This is exactly what happens in history, and simply they cannot believe, that God could reveal this to Daniel 200 to 300 years before these events actually took place. But of course, from the Christian perspective, I believe that, not only does God know the future, right, but sometimes that God does reveal the future to his people, right? And really, as you look at history, right, from a Christian's perspective, when you look at history, right, really what it is, it's God's story being played out through the ages. Right? I know sometimes we, in history class, it's really boring, and we don't like history class. But one ways to look at it is that history is really just God's story being played out through the ages, through the generations. Right? And sometimes God may choose, as His plan unfolds, to reveal some of it to His people. But really, the reason that God does this, right, the reason why God might sometimes tell us a little bit about what's going to happen in the future is not so that we can obsess over the details, And in fact, at the end of this chapter, the angel says to Daniel, just seal up the vision and put it away, right? This is for something far, many years down the line. Just seal up the vision and put it away. And sometimes it's really easy for us to really obsess over these details, right? If the Bible tells us what the future is, we want to know what it is, right? And so many people have obsessed over these details and said, okay, we can figure out what this future is. The Bible's like a puzzle that we can put together. And the thing is, actually, as we're going to see later, a lot of harm can be caused when we take the Bible as this puzzle that's meant to be put together, right? So why does God reveal this to Daniel? Right? What's the point of God revealing the future? Why does God give us these little snippets of what the future might bring? And I think one of the reasons is actually to give us a sense of faith and a sense of assurance in our faith, and to give us a sense of peace as well. Right, because it's clear from this chapter that God is saying that I hold all of history in my hands. Right, I know what's going to happen in the future. Right, all of history belongs to me. Right, I'm the one who's writing history, and if He holds all of history in His hands, I think we can take comfort in the fact that He holds control of our lives as well. Right, and I think the reason why God gives us a hint about the future is to assure us, right, that God is at work. Because it is so easy for us to be discouraged as we look at the world around us, right? And even as we see, Daniel really struggled with this vision. Daniel just really struggled. We're going to see this at the end. Daniel just struggled so much with what he was supposed to do with his vision that he received. And but yet, this vision would be a huge encouragement to generations that come after Daniel. We didn't get into this as much last week, but things are not going super well for the Israelites at this point, right? So in verse 1, right, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at first." Right, so you notice that King Belshazzar is still on the throne, right? So chronologically, this vision would have happened 2 years after last week, but still before chapter 5, right, in the handwriting on the wall. Right, so last week with the 4 beasts and the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, as you might remember. Right, so this happens about 2 years after that, but chronologically, this would still happen before Daniel chapter 5, with all the handwriting on the wall, the last day of King Belshazzar. But what I didn't mention last week was that Belshazzar being on the throne would have made the Israelites feel really uneasy. Right, this is actually not an easy time for the Israelites. If you remember that Daniel, he eventually had a really, really good relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. Right, we talked about how, I believe that Nebuchadnezzar did come to know God and to worship God. And so when Nebuchadnezzar was king throughout those 46 some years, things were probably going pretty well for the Israelites. But now that Belshazzar was on the throne, right, he certainly didn't share the same faith in God, right? Remember, he was the one that kind of took the temple vessels and used them for his debauchery party, right? And so, as Belshazzar is now in charge, right, the Israelites, I think, were getting worried about what this would mean for them, right? Because clearly now they had a king that was against them, and not only that, I think the exiles actually knew that they were about to go home. Right, they knew that the exile was coming to an end because actually, and we're going to see this next week as well, is that God actually told Jeremiah the prophet exactly how long the exile would take. Right, and so in Jeremiah 29, right, it says, "For thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place." And so you can imagine, the Israelites, they're doing their math and they're like, wait, hold up. 70 years is actually pretty close, right? 70 years is coming up, but now that Belshazzar is king, right, how is God going to fulfill his promise? Right, perhaps they're starting to lose a little bit of hope, right? Is God really going to do what he says he's going to do? Is he actually going to bring us back to Jerusalem? Because at this point, they were sitting there with, what is the hope that they have now that Belshazzar is king? And so one of the reasons for visions like this one, is really so that it would be an encouragement to God's people, right? Because God is saying, listen, I know the future, right? I know what the future's hold. I'm writing it, and so therefore don't lose hope. And I think in the same way, this can be true for us as well, right? Why include the book of Revelation, right? Why give us a little bit of a glimpse of what the future might be like? And I think the book of Revelation basically plays the same role in our lives as Daniel 8 might for the Israelites, right? To tell us that, hey, listen, right? We can't work out exactly what's going to happen in the future. But what we do know, right, what we do know is that even when things seem the most bleak, right, even when things seem to be going really poorly, we know and we can be rest assured that God is still writing his story, right? God is still working out his good and perfect will in our lives and in our world today. Right, so I think this is really what these visions are for, right? Is to give the Israelites a hope, give the Israelites assurance, right? Yeah, things look really, really bad, right? But trust, but God says, hey, listen, this is what the future is going to be. And in this case, it's a pretty terrible future. But still, God is saying, listen, I know what it is going to be, right? Trust me in that. Right? And so I think in the same way, this is our encouragement today as we look at these prophecies, is to give us the assurance that God indeed is still working in the world. And so with kind of that encouragement, with that kind of introduction, basically we're just going to walk through the text just so that we have a pretty good understanding of what this text is saying, and then we'll draw some application at the end. So starting in Daniel chapter 8, verse 2. Sorry, it says 2 there, but I meant 8. So chapter 8, verse 2, it says, and I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, I was at the Ulai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. All right, so Daniel couldn't have known this at the time, but Susa was going to eventually be the capital city of Persia. Right, so at this point, it was just the city, but the Persians would one day make it its capital. So since this ram represents Persia, it kind of makes sense that Daniel is going to now be transported into the future capital of Persia, which is Susa. And then notice that this ram had 2 horns, and it says both were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. Right, so if you've been with us, you remember last week the bear, right? Remember the bear also had one side up and one side lower. And basically what that represents is, of course, the Medes and the Persians, right? This was the Mede and Persian Empire. At first, the Medes were superior, and then, of course, the Persians became greater than the Medes, right? Which is why, if you ask someone, they might not know who the Medes were, but they probably knew, most people have probably heard of the Persians, right? Because the Persians became greater. And so, right, so then it says, sorry, I don't know if I'm going to have chapter 2 from here on out, but I meant 8. And so in verse 4 it says, I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southwards. No beast could stand before him. There was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. So this is a pretty helpful map. And so as you can see, Persia at this time was really small in the corner. Right? And so the Media Empire, not like Media PA, but the Media Empire was much bigger at this time, right? So when Cyrus the Great kind of comes over, this is exactly what happens, right? They go north, they go south, they go west, and eventually they go south. This is just the conquest of Cyrus the Great. After Cyrus, future kings would then conquer Egypt. Right, so this is exactly what the vision is talking about. And eventually Persia, right, at this time Media is higher, Persia is smaller, and eventually Persia is going to take over all of it, and Persia becomes higher, right, which is basically what this vision is saying. So Persia is the ram, and they are charging, through the land, just conquering. And by the way, it doesn't take a seminary education to come to this interpretation. Maybe I shouldn't tell you this so you can be more impressed with me, but actually, if you just keep reading, the Bible tells us. So in verse 20, it says, as for the ram that you saw with its 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. So, don't be too impressed with my interpretation. I just know how to read. So, all right, so that's the ram, right? So we've kind of covered this before. We talked about this in Daniel chapter 2 with the statue. We talked about this last week with the bear. And once again, we see this with the ram. This is Persia and Media. And now finally comes some drama because in comes the goat. So verse 5. Oh, good, I switched back to 8. So verse 5, it says, as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had been standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram. He was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him. Okay, so who is this goat? Maybe I should say, who is the goat? No, it's not Tom Brady. It is Alexander the Great. Is the goat. Sorry, I couldn't resist. But we get the confirmation actually in verse 21, right? And the goat is the king of Greece, right? So the goat becomes Alexander the Great. By the way, I thought I'll add this in. As a good interpretive principle of the Bible, it's really important that we can't read 21st century culture and language into the Bible. Not that anyone would do this in this case and think that the Bible is saying that Alexander the Great is the greatest general of all time, which actually he might be. But I don't think that the Bible is not saying this, right? We have to be careful every time we read the Bible not to read our own culture into the text, right? Thinking that the Bible is saying something. In fact, usually what you're supposed to do is, the biblical author has a meaning, right? The biblical author, we don't assume that he's just dictating, right? He writes something down and he has a meaning. And then that meaning has to have some kind of meaning for the people at that time, right? So when the people at the time are reading it, there needs to be a meaning there. And so we have to figure all that out before then we can make application for us today. And so, I think I'll throw that in and not to read things into the Bible. So, we see this goat and this ram going at it. And of course, this represents, all the wars between Greece and Persia. So if you've ever heard, I don't recommend you watching it necessarily, but if you ever watched the movie 300, or especially the one after that, Rise of the Empire, it's basically depicting these battles. The battles between there's epic battles. I'm surprised there's not more movies made of it, but these epic battles between the Greece and the Persian empires. You see that on screen as well. So that's kind of, so the goat is clearly, right, the Greek Empire that starts charging across the world in the Middle East at that time. So we also find a couple of things interesting about this goat, because it says, then the goats became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. All right, so we saw this last week as well, right? So basically, after Alexander the Great, he died really young. He was like 35 years old, and 4 generals come and take up his place and basically divide up the empire, right? So this is the same thing that's saying here. The 4 generals split the kingdom after Alexander the Great died. And then we see this confirmed in verse 22, right? As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power, right? Which is exactly what happens. His 4 generals split up Greece, and none of them are able to regain as much power as Alexander the Great. And so, so notice just how specific this vision is. Right? And this is, I think, why academics have to say there's no way Daniel could have written this 300 years before these events actually happened. Right? Especially at that time, Greece, was just a bunch of city-states fighting each other. They were not united, and there's no chance that they're going to be united. And so, this is why I think they have to say, no, listen, it has to come later, right? This has to come later and then written back into the text, right? Just because of how specific this prophecy is. So now the important part, at least in terms of how it affects the Israelites. So it says in verse 9, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. And so out of the 4 generals, right, that came out of Alexander the Great, there comes this little horn. And what that means is that there's a descendant of one of the 4 generals. And his influence will stretch south towards the glorious land, which is Israel. And as we look into the history books, it's actually pretty clear who this little horn is, because this little horn fits in perfectly with this guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, or sometimes people say Antiochus IV. And you probably never heard of this guy named Antiochus, because in world history, if you ever take world history, you probably wouldn't cover this guy because he was a relatively small dude, and when it comes to world history. But when it comes to Israelite history, right, everybody knows who Antiochus is, right? Because Antiochus becomes this really, really important character in Jewish history. Because notice what he does to the Jewish people. So starting in verse 10, It says, it, meaning this small horn, it grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. And so essentially what this is saying is, so the host of heaven is just a phrase that's sometimes used to describe stars, right? So he's basically saying that these stars, and most likely these stars refer to the Jewish people. And so it's saying that this horn, right, he's going to throw down some of these stars. In other words, kill or trample over and destroy the Israelite people. Right? Also remember, God said to Abraham, right, your descendants will be like the stars of heaven, right? And so these stars are these Jewish believers, and it says Antiochus, he's going to trample and throw down some of these stars, some of these Jewish people. If you kind of look at history, for some reason, Antiochus really hated the Jewish people. He just really hated the Jews, and his goal was to turn Jerusalem into a Greek city. Right, he wanted to turn the Jewish temple into a pagan temple, and he wanted to turn the Jews into Gentiles. He just absolutely hated the Jewish people for some reason. And so that's why when he swept down towards Israel, right, he kind of gave the Israelites a choice, although it really wasn't much of a choice. They either renounced their spiritual and cultural heritage and become Greek, or they would die. And that's basically said that you either convert, you either renounce your God, you either give up your Jewish ways and become Greek, or you will die. And some people estimate that he might have killed over 100,000 Jews on his way down towards Jerusalem. And so this is what this is referring to. Antiochus, throwing down these stars are these Jewish people, right, that he throws down to the ground and tramples them. But that's not all that he does, right? So in verse 11 it says, and it became great, meaning the little horn, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. And so there's a lot of ways to take this, but my take is that the prince of the host probably refers to the great high priest, right, or one of the Jewish leaders. And what he did is that once he conquered Jerusalem, he put an end to the offerings that are being made in the temple. And he actually put a statue of Zeus where the altar is, and then he sacrificed a pig on the altar, right? So he knew that Jewish people, pigs not kosher, and so after he conquered, he set up the statue of Zeus and sacrificed the pig on the altar. He did everything that he possibly could, right, to destroy the Jewish people and destroy Jewish culture. And so this is kind of what Daniel is seeing in his vision, and so you can probably imagine why he's appalled, right? And you can probably imagine why he's just really shook by this vision. So it's actually interesting because after he receives this vision, he seems to be privy to a conversation between two angels. And these two angels also don't know what's going to happen in the future. And so Daniel kind of overhears these two angels talking. And in verse 13 it says, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, 'For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary, and the host to be trampled underfoot?' And he said to me, 'For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state.'" So when did this happen? Right? When was the sanctuary restored to its rightful state? Well, after Antiochus desecrated the temple, what actually happened is that it resulted in a huge Jewish revolt against the Greeks. So especially under this guy named Judas Maccabeus, they fought back against the Greek army and then eventually successfully kicked them out of Israel. And in December, 164 years before Christ, so in December 164 BC, what happened is that they cleansed the temple, and the temple was rededicated to the Lord, just as Daniel saw here in this vision. Now, by the way, did you know that the Jews actually continue to celebrate and remember the rededication of the temple, this exact rededication of the temple? And any guesses into which Jewish holiday falls around December? What Jewish holiday is this? This is Hanukkah. All right, so Hanukkah is the Feast of Dedication, sometimes called the Feast of Dedication. And so it's the Feast of Dedication. It remembers, I think some of you guys knew that it was Hanukkah, but it remembers, right, this event that they kicked the Greeks back out and they rededicated the temple, right, the Feast of Dedication. And it's interesting because I think Jesus also confirms that this is true. Because in John chapter 10, Jesus is actually in Jerusalem while this Feast of Dedication is going on. Right? And so we see kind of Jesus participating in the celebration of Hanukkah. And so now that we've walked through this passage, what are some things that we can learn? All right, so what are we supposed to do with this passage? Things that happened many, many years ago. What does this have to do with us today? Well, let me give you two things. One is an application that probably flows more naturally from the text. Another one, maybe one that you don't expect as much, is actually more of a cautionary tale from church history, and pretty recent church history. I was telling someone the other day, my church history professor used to tell me, there's a church history illustration for every sermon you preach, and I 100% believe her. I just don't know my church history well enough to give you an illustration from church history every single sermon. But I do have one for you today because it's actually kind of a cautionary tale in church history regarding this very passage. And so, so what is this cautionary tale? So in 1818, there was this guy, the Baptist minister named William Miller. All right, so William Miller became convinced that the Bible predicted the exact year of the second coming of Christ. And he based his calculations actually on Daniel chapter 8. He was reading Daniel chapter 8, and he said, he read the chapter, and he's like, okay, I am now convinced, right? After doing a lot of study, he says, I'm convinced that in Daniel chapter 8, it tells us the exact date when Jesus is going to return. And his main text is this one right here in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, where it says, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. And so what he did is that he understood 2,300 evenings and mornings to mean 2,300 years. And by the way, that's not too uncommon in biblical prophecy. Sometimes days really do mean years, and we might talk about that as we go along in Daniel. And so he took the 2,300 evening and mornings to mean 2,300 years. And then he took the sanctuary being restored to mean the second coming of Christ. So Jesus is coming back in 2,300 years. So the question becomes 2,300 years from which date? And so the date that he picked was 457 BC. So basically that's the year when King Artaxerxes of Persia said that, hey, Jews, you can go back and rebuild Jerusalem. So he picked that date, and this became really exciting, right? You can imagine him in his study, he's doing his math, because 2,300 years from 457 BC turns out to be the year 1843. And he discovers this in 1818. Right, so in 1818, he says, Jesus is coming back in 25 years. Now, you might just think this is just one dude in the study, maybe he convinces a couple people, but no, he actually, within those 25 years, convinces thousands of people around the world that Jesus is coming back in 1843. And, sometimes, you might, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I know when I was a kid, I read a lot of my mom would just give me Christian books to read, and one of the Christian books was Left Behind. And I don't think she really knew what she was giving me, but she's just like, here's a book, read it, it's Christian, it's good. And, so there is a lot of excitement, over what the second coming of Christ is. And I don't know how you guys feel about this, but really when people predict when Jesus is coming, it can have some really big real world impacts. Because it turns out, people actually live differently when they believe that Jesus is coming back in 25 years. And so, what happened is that farmers decided that what's the point of resowing my field when Jesus is coming back, right? Or people started selling off their house to pay off debt, because they're getting ready to meet the Lord, which I also find very interesting, because if I knew that Jesus was coming back, I don't know if I would pay off my debt. I'll be like, I don't know, I'll just live it up. But no, they were like, no, I really need to come before the Lord and sanctify myself and, get ready for the meeting of the Lord. So they actually sold off their house, paid off their debt, lived a pretty good life for that year. More holy than me, I don't know. I feel like I might not do that. But, and so that's what they did. And so there's actually real world impact, right? There's really harm that can be caused, when people are convinced that Jesus is coming back on a specific date. So of course, when 1843 came and went, in history it became known as the Great Disappointment. right? And so if you Google Great Disappointment, you'll basically read the story. It became known as the Great Disappointment. Now, even though William Miller, basically lost like all credibility, right, because he got the date wrong, he actually inspired a lot of people to take up this belief. The belief that if you look hard enough at the Bible, right, the truth about Jesus' second coming can be discovered. Right, that if you just look really hard enough, that you can actually figure out the exact dates. And actually, out of this movement, which is called the Millerite movement, but out of this movement, most notably came the Seventh-day Adventist. So the Seventh-day Adventist basically is, which today actually still has 21 million members today, basically came out of this Great Disappointment movement where it inspired a whole generation and generations of people to say, if we can really just find out, we can really know Jesus' second coming if we just, puzzle the Bible together. Now, of course, I think for us, or for me, I believe when Jesus says in Matthew 24, right, that no one can know the day or the hour of his return except the Father. It means that even though this is really fascinating to think about and it's pretty interesting, the Bible is not a puzzle to be put together, right? The Bible is not, we're not supposed to take out our calculators and do a bunch of math and figure out when Jesus' second coming is going to come. But the fact is, if you go on Wikipedia, you can search up so many predictions of the second coming of Christ. And so, I was interested this week, and so, I went back and read some of them. But even from 500 years to Christ all the way to the year 2057, right, there's so many predictions of when, even between now and 2030, I think there's like 3 predictions that Jesus is going to come back in this decade. And I think the sad thing is that it really does harm to real people, right, that might believe in these claims. And so that's kind of the cautionary tale that I want to share with you as it comes to this specific text here. But finally, let me give you one last application that maybe flows a little more directly from the text. And the application is be appalled, but keep on working. Be appalled, but keep on working. So the reason for this is because look at how Daniel responds to all this at the end of the chapter. All right, so Daniel in verse 27 says, "And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it." Of course, Daniel was appalled. Right? Of course he was appalled, right? Because he saw the desecration of the temple. He saw thousands of Jews being murdered by this little horn. But then it says, yet, after a few days, he rose and went about the king's business. Now you have to remember, who is Daniel working for? Right, he's working for King Belshazzar, right, one of the most wicked kings that he's had to serve under. But yeah, I believe the reason why he was able to stand up and get back to work, right, is because in his heart he always knew, right, that the true king that he really worked for was always God. That no matter what king he was working for, no matter what boss he was working for, no matter what situation he was working for, right, he always remembered that the one person he really was working for was God. And there's so many things in our world today that can also make us sick to the stomach, right? Maybe like the angel in verse 13, right? We also want to know how long, right? How long will the wicked continue to prosper? How long will God allow wickedness, to be spread throughout the earth? I think God encourages us to ask these questions. It's okay to be appalled. But I think one of the things we see here is that if our hope is in God, what it allows us to do, right, is to not be paralyzed by fear, right, and not to withdraw from the world, right? Because I think you see two reactions sometimes, right? You see people who are really working hard in the world, right, but yet they forget that God holds the future in their hands. On the other hand, you have people who, I believe that God holds the future in their hands, and then they don't go back to work, or they don't work, or they don't fight, they don't, live as God has called us to live in this world. But only the Christian can do both, right? That Daniel rose back up and went back to work. Right, the Christian does both. On the one hand, we work, right, because God has called us to. But on the other hand, we have that assurance that the future is indeed in God's hands. And we have to have both of them in our lives, right? And so, I think, in reading this chapter, in some ways I'm glad that I don't know the future. Because I think, like Daniel, I would be pretty terrified at what this all means. But even though we don't know the future, I think what God gives us is even though we don't understand everything, I think we understand enough. Right? And especially now that we live so far away from Daniel, we can actually understand more of God's plan. Right? Because in God's perfect plan, we know that he also sent his son Jesus. And on the cross, right, it also looked like evil was winning. Right? On the cross, it also looked like that wickedness was going to win. Right? This perhaps would be the greatest victory Satan could achieve. Right? Killing the Son of God. But yet, little did he know, what he thought would be his greatest triumph ended up being his greatest defeat. Right? Because after the cross, we know, comes the resurrection. Right? And with it, the defeat of our greatest enemies, of sin and death. And so because we know this in history, right, as we look at what God has done in history, we know that we can trust him. And if God has defeated for us, right, our greatest enemies of sin and death, it gives us hope, really, in the smaller battles that we face in our lives today. And so I think God encourages us that it's right to be appalled, right, when we look at the world around us. But at the very same time, we also go back to work. We actually continue to work, knowing that the future is safe in God's hands. And that's really the point of these prophecies, right? The point of these prophecies is to remind us that all history is in God's hands. And so even though we don't understand everything, right, we do understand enough. And I'm praying that by God's grace that we can still stand up and get back to work on the King's business, for we know that we can not only trust God in the here and now, but we know that we can trust God forevermore. So will you join me as I pray? God, we thank you because we believe that all of your word is profitable for teaching, for correction, for rebuke, for the training in righteousness, so that the man of God would be trained for every good work, so that we would be trained for every good work that you have called us, that you have prepared in advance for us to do as we look at your word. And even in the midst of these prophecies that are very confusing and maybe unsure of what we can do, we still believe that your word speaks truth in our lives. And then we believe, because that you have revealed this to Daniel, that indeed all the future is in your hands. And so, Father, I pray that you would give us this assurance, Father, that you would give us this hope that we can continue to be faithful to the work that you have called us to do, but that it would not drive us to despair as we look at the world around us, and as we're appalled by the world around us. Seemingly every week, every month, there's something more to be, that kind of wrecks our heart. And so, Father, I pray that you would give us the sustaining hope that is in you, and even if we need to, like Daniel, lay sick for a while, that you would give us the strength to rise back up and